My name is Jasper Hugtenburg. I'm a landscape architect and geographer at H+N+S Landscape Architects. We're based in the Netherlands. And in this following presentation, I would like to highlight some of the projects that we did on the subject of water management. But maybe first, let me tell you something about myself. I was born and raised in one of the Dutch polders, a truly man-made landscape that present day looks something like this. The polder is called the Hoekse and it's located south of the city of Rotterdam. It hasn't always looked like this. Some 150 years ago, the place looked like this. This is an old map of the region. Of course, the city of Rotterdam was much smaller then, but also the polder itself has changed dramatically. And when I was a young boy, my mother worked at the polder redesign committee of this polder, the Hoekse Waard. And at that moment, they were restructuring the polder. And I think that has been a very important theme in Dutch landscape architecture. And I think these reconstructions of the polders, some of them were good, some of them were maybe less successful, but they really illustrate how we work on a tradition of landscape architecture based on the landscape that is already there, created in generations before us, and that we have the privilege to adjust these landscapes to present day needs. And of course, living in a polder, you're always aware of the dangers of the water around you. So in the Netherlands, the Great Flood of 1953 is actually still a big theme. It devastated a large part of the southwest of the Netherlands, of the Rhine-Meuse Delta. And up to this day, we're still working on preventing such a disaster from happening again. And fascinated by the waters around this polder, I started out as a student of physical geography at the University of Utrecht, where I specialized in coastal and river systems. And I think this is a very interesting map because it shows not only the present day rivers that we have in the Netherlands, in our delta, but also all the rivers that are underlying this landscape. And it's actually also these underlying rivers that play a crucial part in the Dutch landscape. As a student of physical geography at the University of Utrecht, I learned all about the Dutch river system, and not just the present-day river system, but all the river systems that has preceded that through the Pleistocene and Holocene geological areas. So here we see a map of all these present day and past river systems, and together they form the substratum of the Dutch delta. And they are really something to take into consideration when you're designing landscape in a delta area. Here we see a picture of the present day river landscape of the Netherlands, with the river to the left and lower so-called summer dikes in the middle of the image, and the winter dike, the higher dike that will prevent adjacent polders from flooding at the far right of the image, protecting a village behind the dike. And while I was a physical geographer working at the National Water Authority, I got into contact with a great project called Room for the River. It was a long-term project all over the Netherlands that was aiming at making the Netherlands a safer place and preventing future floods from happening. But there was also a second goal to this project, and that was improving the spatial quality of the river landscape. Before this project, some parts of the river landscape were, well, frankly, quite messy. There was a goal set out to make this landscape simply more attractive again, and also to improve the ecological quality of this landscape. And that was also the time that I got in touch with some people from H+N+S Landscape Architects who were doing a lot of these projects and who were actually chairing the quality team for the Room for the River project. This Room for the River project was actually primed by an old project of H+N+S Landscape Architect, which was actually the project that started the office. It was a competition at the time for designing both more functional and more ecologically functional river landscape. And out of that competition came the entry of what is now known as H+N+S Landscape Architect, called Plan Ooijen-Wanssum, the Black Stork project. And it was this project, this competition, that both started the Room for the River project, but also started regional design in the Netherlands and taking into account ecological processes. And you could also say that this also started what we now like to call the Dutch approach to landscape architecture. So let me just explain in just a few key words what this Dutch approach means to us. So when our office celebrated their 25th anniversary, we had landscape architect Noël van Doren analyzed this Dutch approach, not just with our office, but with other offices in the Netherlands. And he arrived at what could be called 4 maxims that are essential to this Dutch approach. So these 4 maxims are: scale is a matter of design. If it performs, it's beautiful. Design is an invitation. And landscape is a process is a landscape. So let us first look at the matter of scale. So I think the most obvious element in the Dutch approach is the scale that we are working at. We're working at large-scale landscapes, sometimes comprising a whole country or a part of a country, sometimes even a continent. At this scale, it's for many landscape architects, it might be feel a bit uncomfortable to actually design at this scale. We have grown to be quite comfortable at designing at very large scales, not just cities, but entire regions, also tackling the relationship between cities and the landscape. And it's at this scale that we really also address the political agenda. And it's this regional scale that informs the qualities that might be needed on a more local scale. So there's always this linkage between the larger regional scale and the smaller, more concrete local scale. If it performs, it's beautiful. That's all about the system, the landscape as a system. In our projects, we do not only look at the way the landscape looks and how we can improve those looks, we also really look at how it functions. So we see the landscape not just as a picture, but also as a machine. And in a machine, as soon as you dive under the hood, you're faced with an enormous complexity of how this machine works. And we really invest in getting to know this machine, knowing what works, what doesn't work. And we also try to find what are the pieces that we can adjust in this machines? What are the switches that we can flick? And we found out that if we find these switches, if we make if we flick the right switches, then the landscape that will come out of this new and improved system has a natural beauty that performs well as a landscape. And we also realized that landscape architecture is a very open-ended process. So design may set things in motion, but then it's up to the landscape itself and up to the actors in those landscape to create the further steps. A good design sets things in motion and on the way to become a better landscape. And this is something that we do not do alone. In all our projects, we work together in close collaboration with other professionals, but also with stakeholders who own parts of the landscape, who are involved in the landscape, and whose needs that we need to address with landscape design. So landscape design for us is not being behind the drawing board all the time. It's also really about being in workshops with other people, getting to know their interests, getting to know their concerns, and taking those concerns to the drawing board and come up with solutions. So now just have a look at the water challenges that we are facing in the Netherlands, and to which the Dutch approach might offer at least the beginning of solutions. So in the Netherlands, as in many delta areas in the world, the water is coming from all sides. We have water flowing down in our rivers. We have water coming from the sea. We have rainwater storms coming out of the sky. And last but not least, we have our groundwater table that is of growing concern. Some of these challenges are laid upon us. In the Netherlands especially, we have a long history with flooding. Flooding usually coming from the rivers, but also from the sea. This is where climate change affects deltas most. The climate change, the rising of the global temperature, will cause the sea level to rise, and that will, of course, threaten low-lying delta countries like the Netherlands. But that's not the only effect of climate change. It also increases the river discharges and lowers the discharges during dry summer months. and it makes rainstorms more intense. But we can't blame it all on nature. We are also ourselves to blame. In this slide, you see how the Dutch Delta came about in past 5,000 years during the Holocene geological area. And the natural processes that have created this landscape are also capable of keeping up with sea level rise and using sediments that are provided by the sea and by the rivers. But the problem started when we started intervening in this natural landscape. The landscape that was given to us, a delta landscape, was not very fitted for living, for agriculture. So we pumped out all of the water. And we did that through an ingenious system that we now know as the polder landscape. But pumping out all of this water has also created subsidence in the Dutch subsoil. And this is an irreversible process that is haunting us. We've done more or less the same to our river systems. When the river landscape was given to us, it was free-flowing and the river could discharge its water and its sediment along its banks, thereby maintaining the landscape by itself. But we wanted to live in this landscape. We wanted to build houses, perform agriculture, so we needed to protect ourselves against the river. And we did so by making dikes. We started out at a very local scale, just protecting local villages and protecting local fields. But this system soon grew out to be what we now know as the Dutch dike system. And although this is an internationally praised system that has kept us safe for so many centuries already, it also has a downside. It means that the river can't discharge its water and sediment into the polders lying next to the river anymore, and that will also create these polders to subside. I think it's fair to say that Dutch landscape architecture originated from our battle against the water. Here we see the Beemster polder, which was formerly known as the Beemster Lake. That was a lake that was created by peat extraction in the landscape and that we wanted to use for agriculture. Now, on this tabula rasa, there were a lot of investors that invested in this bold undertaking, and they all wanted their share. They all wanted their piece of the pie. And the engineers, who you might call landscape architects avant la lettre, imposed a rigid grid upon this lake in order to divide the lake into sizable pieces suitable for agriculture. Not unlike some American cities are constructed based on a grid. So that was the beginning of what is now a long-standing Dutch planning tradition. And in this tradition, we did not only make landscape, but we also envisioned future landscapes. And we have a great tradition starting in the previous century with making scenarios for future landscapes. This is an image for the project Nederland nu als ontwerp in the 1980s, in which we drew plans for the entire Netherlands based on 4 scenarios. And we kept on doing so also in the delta that we are talking about right now. I will now illustrate the Dutch approach to water systems with 3 projects that we recently did in the Netherlands. And with these projects, I will take you on a journey along the river Meuse, which is one of the smaller rivers in Europe. And we will start at the origin of the Meuse in the south of the Netherlands, continuing into Belgium and France. We will then flow downstream to a project about halfway the river Meuse, and we will end in the Rhine-Meuse delta near the city of Rotterdam. So let's start off with the head of the system. Here we worked on a valley called the Guldal. The river Geul is a small river originating in Belgium just across the Dutch border that has experienced some severe flooding in the summer of 2021. And after this flooding, we were commissioned to come up with a plan. We were commissioned by a nature organization to develop a plan to prevent future flooding based on nature-based solutions. So it's actually water retention projects where we use rewilding processes to keep the water or to retain the water. This is how the present day Geul system works. So it's originally a very forested landscape in which we've developed some quite intense agriculture. And this all causes water that falls within the watershed to run off much more quickly than it did in the past. And that mainly causes two problems. During severe storm floods, water is rapidly discharged to the river and from the river to the river Meuse, in which the Geul discharges. And that causes the flooding that we experienced in the summer of 2021. But there's also another side to this modified water system. And that is that the water doesn't only cause flooding, but because it disappears so rapidly after rainstorms, it also causes droughts during the dry and warm summer months. So we've come up with a set of 6 principles based on all the phases where the rain water flows through the landscape, from the part where the rain falls on the canopy to the part where it's being discharged by the river. And in all of these 6 phases, we have opportunities to use nature, to use natural elements in the landscape to retain the rainwater and so retain it in the landscape, prevent flooding downstream, and also retain it for the dry summer months. And in the end, a landscape that is based on nature-based solutions can look like this, where there's much more vegetation introduced in the landscape and other elements, other natural elements that retain water. And that will mean that the water stays within the landscape for a much longer period, and it will drain out of the landscape on a much longer time scale, preventing floods to happen downstream. I will just show 2 examples of these measures because it's not completely redesigning the landscape and replacing agriculture by nature, but these are really interventions in the agricultural landscape that use nature as a building block. So here's a system of infiltration barriers that we proposed for the agricultural landscape, where in present situation water runs off to the river at a very fast pace. But if every 100 or 200 meters we create a small barrier for this surface runoff, then the water gets a chance to be held back and to infiltrate in the soil and being preserved for the drier summer months. And this is what it will look like on the map. Again, it's not complete makeover of the landscape. It's actually a quite subtle introduction of natural elements within the cultural landscape that makes sure that the runoff indicated by the blue arrow is held back at these infiltration barriers and is infiltrated in the ground where it joins the groundwater table. Another crucial element in this cultural landscape are the so-called hollowways. These are roads that are orientated perpendicular to the altitude contours, thereby creating a concentration of surface runoff, which will in its turn make the hollowways even deeper and creating an even bigger runoff concentration effect. If we allow the runoff to escape from these hollowways and flow into the adjacent fields or forests, then we can prevent this runoff from reaching the river downstream and preventing floods further downstream. So again, on the map, continuous blue arrows are being cut and water is being diverted into the landscape and again being preserved in the groundwater table rather than being directed to the river, causing floods further downstream. And this will not only create a safer water system, it will also create a much more attractive landscape and a landscape that is much more suitable for non-human habitation. In a way here we use natural elements to make a more natural, a more safe water system, but this also contributes to the quality of the landscape and nature itself. Now, these are just 2 of 10 individual measures that we've designed, and altogether they form a nature-based system that retains water within the catchment for a much longer period of time, thereby preventing droughts in the summer and preventing floods after intensive rainfall. If we then move further downstream, then the river Meuse matures as a full-grown river, but there the flooding risk, of course, doesn't end. And this is a position of the river even before diking. So here we see on the map that the river is cutting through higher topography, so it has natural retaining walls on both sides. But because as humans we've crept up to the river and we've both been building and developing agriculture along the river, the flooding of the river still causes us problems. So we need to deal with that, and we really need to zoom in into the river landscape. So in this project, we accommodated river flow into the natural landscape. We were actually commissioned to come up with dikes along the river, but that's for us seemed to be very strange in a landscape that has never known dikes. So one of the challenges for us in this project was to develop dikes in a landscape that has never seen dikes before. And the way to do that is to look at the underlying topography. And here the past river system comes into play again, because as we saw on the earlier map by Utrecht University of the Dutch river system in the Holocene, there's also traces in the landscape where the river has flown in past times, and that can still be used present day to accommodate higher floods. So here we see the topography of the Ooijen-Wanssum area with on the left-hand side the altitude or the elevation map, and on the right-hand side the plan that came out of it. And it's clear that we've used this lower terrace channel at the bottom of the image, which before this project started was just a dry element in the landscape. We used that to accommodate the river flow during higher discharges. So this project was all about redeveloping this lower river terrace into a river landscape that can accommodate higher levels of flooding. And we did not only design with the spatial dimensions of the place, but also with the temporal dimensions. In this slide, you see what we call a river calendar, where the frequency with which the landscape floods is related to the extent of flooding over time. So the left-hand side, you see the normal daily situation with the river being held in its riverbed. And on the right-hand side, you see what the river landscape looks like during flooding. The intensity of flooding that you see on the right-hand side of the picture doesn't happen frequently, but very shortly after this project was realized, we had the 2021 floods that really were the proof of the pudding for this project, as it kept the region safe and it accommodated the river flows. So based on this substratum and based on the measures that we took to keep this landscape safe, we also created a recreative network and that's where the water calendar really came into play, because at times of flooding, some parts of the recreative network are simply inaccessible, but then we designed different routings through the project area that can still make these places accessible through other routes. So while the essence of this project was to use the underlying river landscape and to use that channel that we still had in one of the lower terraces that accommodates river flow, but it didn't accommodate river flow enough so that we didn't have to build dikes. So the other part of this project was really all about the dikes that we were going to construct in this landscape that has never seen dikes before. So how do you do that? Well, the great thing about new river channel was that there was a lot of sediment that had to be taken out of the landscape. And we actually used that sediment to cover up the dikes or to integrate the dikes into much more natural landscape elements like the higher grounds that you see on the top of this image and the edge of the terraces that you see on the bottom of this image. So these are actually full-fledged dike profiles covered by much more natural looking landscape phenomenon. And the result of that was that we created a much more natural looking river landscape where the river is simply flowing in the lower part parts of the landscape that are bordered by a very clear barrier between the more natural river landscape and the more cultural, agricultural landscape on the higher levels of the terrace. And of course, because we made this new channel, we also created an island in the landscape. So during floods, a part of the project area is not accessible anymore because of this new channel. So strategic locations, we had to position bridges that cross the low-lying natural river landscape. And some of these bridges are accessible by car and by bike, and others only needed to be accessible by foot. And with these bridges that we needed to construct for pedestrians, we really introduced much more natural and much more adventurous ways to cross the landscape, which you see on these pictures. And for the bridges that really connect the main part of the infrastructure, we also really made them very present in the landscape, connecting the cultural landscape on both sides. So this is a project that was designed and constructed. We also supervised the construction of this project, and it really created a very natural looking river landscape that accommodates river flow and that really proved to be effective during the 2021 floods, where none of these dikes overflowed and the river landscape really performed well. So this, I think, is a very nice example of the maxim: if it performs well, it's beautiful. As we continue our journey along the river, we eventually end at the sea. And this is where the river Meuse and the river Rhine join in what we know as the Rhine-Meuse Delta area near the city of Rotterdam. This was also a regional design competition where the brief was to make this area not only safer against flooding, but also making it a nicer area to live in. So it's really about reinventing the city as the city of Rotterdam as a delta city, with not just water defense strategies, but also strategies of connecting people much more to the water and to the natural delta landscape. After the Second World War, the Rotterdam harbor expanded in a very rapid pace all the way from the inland city of Rotterdam to the coast. And that has covered a landscape that used to be known as the two-river landscape, with natural channels flowing gently through an agricultural landscape. In the present-day situation, this two-river landscape is a heavily used harbor industry landscape that blocks out all natural processes that once used to form this delta, and that distributed water and sediment across the delta, enabling the delta landscape to keep up with sea level rise. But this industrial harbor landscape will also change in the future. And the challenge of this project was to use these changes that are arising in the industrial harbor landscape to create a more natural and self-sustaining landscape that can keep up with sea level rise. For this project, we look back in time. We look back in time 150 years ago and analyzed all the developments and trends that took place in this 150 years. And we asked ourselves, how will these trends evolve in the future? What needs to be changed? And how can the river, or how can this landscape accommodate future challenges like sea level rise? Based on these historical trends, we proposed some measures that will make the landscape around the Rotterdam harbor more fit for future challenges. And these interventions were aimed at allowing the delta landscape to make itself rise with sea level again. And for that, we needed to activate natural processes like sedimentation that has been going on so long before human intervention in this landscape. So how do we do that in this heavily industrialized harbor landscape? Analyzing this industrial landscape, we found that the two channels that are connecting the river landscape to the sea could be altered in a way that one of the channels would be primarily aimed at accommodating large vessels, while the other then could be aimed at accommodating natural processes like flooding and sedimentation. And the key to make this intervention was one of the locks in the harbor that just needed to be sized up in order to make this connection for shipping and in order to separate these two channels. And while doing so, the other channel, the channel to the north, the so-called Nieuwe Waterweg, is allowed to import sediment again, and this sediment can then be the building block of raising the city and harbor landscape. So here we see these channels next to each other in the present day situation where, although there's some differences between the channel on the left and the channel on the right, their primary goal is to accommodate shipping. But by intervening in the harbor landscape and by upgrading this one shipping lock, we could create a much more versatile landscape where the channel on the left is primarily used for shipping and through which ships can also reach the river landscape. And the river on the right-hand side is then primarily used for river discharge and will regain its natural ability to import sediment. And this also makes the Nieuwe Waterweg, the river channel on the right, a much more attractive location to live and work and recreate. And the Nieuwe Waterweg is allowed to import sediment deep into the river system where it can be dredged at a much smaller scale and can be used to raise the topography on either side of the river, thus creating a landscape that is higher above sea level and that is not only attractive but also safe to live in. And at the same time, this raising of the channel floor also prevents salt water from intruding too far into the landscape. But of course, with sea level rise, salt water will protrude further into the landscape through this channel. So we developed a freshwater distribution system, again using the older channels that are still present in the landscape. And this is also a way of reviving these older channels that in the present day situation are not always that obvious in the landscape. This results in a delta city that is not only safe, but also much more enjoyable to live in. And at the same time, we can use the changes that occur in the harbor where places fall out of function and are being redeveloped as living areas to become much more attractive place to live in. So here we see the present day harbor landscape, which obviously is not a very attractive place to live in. But with the reintroduction of the natural processes, this becomes much more like green-blue backbone, not only for ecology, but also for human habitation. So what does this Dutch approach have to offer to modern society and the challenges that it faces? I think as landscape architects, one thing that we bring in is optimism. There's always a way out of these problems. If we analyze these problems, if we analyze the underlying landscape, then we can always find a way or a perspective that we might have to overcome these challenges. In the Netherlands, we've overcome some of these challenges ourselves too. We are talking now about water management issues, but in the Netherlands we also have quite a lot of issues when it comes to the quality of our ecosystems. And in the Netherlands, in the last century, we've made the shift from going from only nature conservation, only conserving the areas that are still left, to nature development. And landscape architecture, and I would say the Dutch approach in landscape architecture, played a huge role in that. A classic example is the so-called Naardermeer, the lake next to Naarden, which was one of these polders that we just couldn't pump the water out. And there was this decision made that if we can't put the water out, then well, maybe we should just embrace the water in the polder. And it has turned out to be one of the most wonderful natural landscapes in the entire Netherlands.